Hello guys, Airsick Hydra here, and as promised in today's video we're going to be discussing camera angles within ARPGs and other genres too. And then we're going to relate this to Inquisitor Martyr to talk about its advantages and disadvantages with its current camera system, give the devs a little bit of feedback on this, and as well as that talk about some of the potential remedies that may satisfy players that don't currently have much love for the current camera system. But before we get started into the video guys, remember to like, remember to subscribe. We're so close to 500 subs, and well, I'm really hyped for that. I've got a bottle of wine waiting in the fridge for when that happens. So let's crack on with the video. So start off with, as you've seen, Inquisitor Martyr is an ARPG with a top-down camera. So it's similar to Diablo 3, Path of Exile, Grim Dawn, all of those games. And there are certain advantages to a top-down camera, and it's very well suited to an ARPG, because an ARPG's combat is inherently not that complex compared to something like a MMO where you have a lot of buttons to press. What you find in an ARPG instead is they make the combat revolve around the complexity of where you move your character and the decisions you make. So what they do is they open up a 360-degree field for you to play in, and therefore the camera plump puts you straight in the middle of that. And then rather than thinking about having to aim abilities, etc., your combat's much more focused on moving around, avoiding attacks, dodging, etc. Whereas if you compared this to an FPS game, which is an over-the-shoulder camera, obviously the combat's much more orientated partly towards the decisions you make, but more so towards the actual aiming ability. Obviously in an ARPG you don't really have to aim much, you click in a vague direction, which is something really sort of intuitive to players, so there's really not much skill in aiming. The skill is knowing where to move and when to move. So the other features of a top-down camera system are that the short field of view means that you're constantly surprised by new enemies, and this is an intentional feature within ARPGs, that when you're walking around a map, all of a sudden you'll meet an enemy that you weren't expecting, and they may have a set of abilities that you weren't expecting, and you will have to react to that. The lack of planning is an inherent feature to the ARPG, because, well, in many of the games in Diablo, Path of Exile, if you knew what enemy was around the corner, you could avoid them if they're too difficult for you to kill, which would save you from dying. Or you could just equip some different equipment. I know in Inquisitor you can't do this, but this is just why it's generally done. If you knew that there was a fire enemy in front of you on Path of Exile, you could just equip some fire resist gear and then off you go. It really doesn't make much sense to take this feature away, but we'll come back to this in a moment. Again, just as a little recap, it's focusing on 360-degree combat, avoiding damage, dodging, focusing on the decisions you make in combat rather than anything else. Now, you compare that to a FPS game, you've got a 180-degree, normally, action field where all of the action is in front of you somewhere. So the levels themselves are designed in a way, they're very linear. You move forwards, there's not a lot of backtracking, you're constantly moving toward the action because it's always in this 180-degree field. Yes, there's different paths and some games will do different levels, but it's essentially always the same thing. And then when you do go into combat, even though it's fairly predictable because you can see enemies coming a mile away, you still get to sort of play around with being able to aim and sort of plan some strategies as to where you're going to go. It has its own benefits, of course, but it's a very different focus. Now, from what we've described thus far, there are two very different map styles for the two different camera games. For a 360-degree game, for a top-down view, typically you've got very open maps, wide open spaces, and enemies coming at you from all directions, and the exploration is very much of a 360-degree nature as well. And again, just to emphasize, the map design within a shoulder camera game is completely different, because if you have enemies behind you in a shoulder cam game, you will die if it's a fairly hard difficulty. And that's the issue that, or the first major issue that Inquisitor Martyr finds itself in. What they've done is they've designed fairly enclosed maps with this beautiful gothic setting and high walls, very high walls for an ARPG, which makes sense. The Warhammer universe has amazing architecture and they really wanted to showcase this off. However, here's where they come into their first issue. Not only are the walls a lot higher than the average ARPG, You see, the average ARPG will design all of its maps around having a fixed camera generally, which makes it really easy to say, okay, if we just shave off a bit of the bottom side of the map so it's a little bit lower, then your field of view is never going to be obscured. And that's where, and I know some of you will be thinking, yeah, well, Grim Dawn has the option to rotate the camera and there's not much obstruction. Well, Grim Dawn was actually designed for a fixed camera and then they allowed you to rotate it. So they really did design every map within that game to have a fixed camera, so wherever you walked, your field would never be obstructed enough. Now, Inquisitor Martyr has not done that. They've designed the game with the purpose that you will be rotating your camera. And here's really the issue, is some people don't like rotating their camera, and the high walls quite often obscure your vision. And there's a few reasons for this. Firstly, that they are very, very high, and that's, of course, probably the major one. But rather than just get rid of them, they do have some opacity settings, so when you're walking past a wall or a doorway, some of them slowly fade away. Now, I think that's probably our first point of criticism towards Inquisitor Martyr. If you look at the following footage, not only are there some items that don't seem to have a working opacity setting, they just stay there, which is most likely a bug and just something that needs fixing. But as well as that, I would say on occasion the field of view around your character, I think, needs to be slightly larger, so you lose less of the character when you're around a wall. Now, they can probably make the argument, well, you've got a free floating camera, why not use it? And, well, again, just coming back to what I previously said, this is one of the issues. Not everyone in Grim Dawn wanted to rotate their camera. And I think not everyone in Inquisitor Martyr wants to rotate their camera, but the fact is that they have to. And then you come into the issue of, well, how do you rotate the camera? This is where a lot of the cries for a shoulder camera has come into the game, or a first-person view, third-person view rather. And while I do respect that that would very much fix the issue of the control and the obstruction of your vision, but it does come with a huge issue, and that is that in a top-down game, avoiding damage in a 360-degree area cannot be compatible, in my personal view, and this is just a personal view, but it's not compatible with the type of combat that's in the game. If you played Diablo 3 and you put a piece of cardboard over the bottom half of the screen, which is really what a shoulder camera do, yes, it increases your pitch forwards, but if you did that in Diablo 3, you would just die repeatedly, same with Path of Exile. The issue is you have to see what's behind you, because as soon as you approach difficult content, if you're a squishy character, you will probably die in one hit from something. So you just have to have the ability to know what's behind you. You have to have this sort of thing in the current game setup. If you think back to The Witcher, originally that was a top-down view and a completely different game, and they decided to change the camera from a top-down view, but in doing so they had to remake the entire game. All of the level layout, everything had to be redone to account for this. And so the two camera angles for me aren't compatible with the same combat system. It's just they're apples and oranges, and you can either have one type of map and combat or another. But if you've got abilities coming at you from different directions, if you need to know where the cover is around you, it's going to be really difficult with a shoulder camera. But I do appreciate that the game would probably be very cool with that type of camera. It would be very cool, just impossible to stay alive. Now, obviously, the difficulties with controlling the camera thus far are that, as we've said, not everyone wants to actually move the camera, and therefore there is also sort of people thinking outside the box. Can we put in an automated camera feature? While it's a good idea, the trouble is again, going back to this 360-degree combat, is you have to change direction quite a lot in an ARPG. If you watch any footage from a top-down game like this, of this genre rather, you have to click in front of you, behind you, in front of you, behind you, if you're looking to dodge and juke, which you will have to do in higher difficulties. And if the camera was following your person, it would not only make you immensely motion sick, but everything in the world would constantly be moving around you, and it would make any form of aiming or grounding of where you are impossible. So that's the issue. While you could have a third-person view and have a button to instantly do a 180, I don't think they'll probably pursue that route, as it would be still it would require too much skill to use, and as I say, make majority of the difficult content impossible. So Automated cameras, there are potentially some other ideas as well. You could have certain tile sets where if you walk into a room, let's say these certain gates, you could walk through it and the camera could automatically centre in a certain direction for the room that you're just about to walk into. That's a nice idea, but the issue then arises that what if you're being chased by something and you're walking in a specific direction, and then while you're walking you go through one of these places and the camera rotates and suddenly then you click in the wrong place and you're dead. It's something that needs to remain controllable by the character, but I do think there are some other solutions as well. So the auto rotate again I think is very dangerous, that just by having the world moving around your character as a moving variable is a little bit too risky. I think a fairly simple remedy, if players wanted to readjust their camera, would be a simple button that rotates the camera towards where the player is shooting in a very quick manner. Now, I'm not saying that it has to be implemented. This is just one of many ideas that could be done. We'll talk through some of the others in a moment, but one of them I think would be if you're walking in a certain direction. Now, rather than fiddling around with the mouse, let's just say you press the F key and instantly the camera goes to that direction. It would be a bit confusing if you were holding down click to move and then pressed it, because then you would sort of end up walking in a circle, I presume. I don't know how that would work. You would have to click to move somewhere, release the click key, and then click the camera in this direction button. But it's maybe an option. Now, there are other options too to improve this. If you look at Grim Dawn, the camera focus is actually slightly north of the character, ever so slightly. It's more towards their head. And obviously the maps have therefore been designed in a way that you're always moving north, east, west. You're never really moving south towards enemies because it's incredibly awkward. Now, that is something Inquisitor Martyr could do, and they could just say, well, if you orientate the map as this rough direction, so you're moving from here to that direction, then by shifting the map up maybe sort of 1 or 2 feet in terms of the character's dimensions, that could maybe open up the field of view enough to make people feel like the ranged combat is a little bit less clunky. Obviously at the expense, though, that if anyone is south of them, it's going to cause a headache. Now, equally, to increase the field of view, you can just zoom out a little bit as well. That comes with the drawback of having things become harder to see, and if the visuals at the moment have been tailored to a certain size and a certain appearance, by zooming out it can sometimes trivialise enemies. It can sort of break down some of the actual immersion. It's nice to look at, but it can also be argued to make the content far too easy. If you took Path of Exile, Diablo 3, any of those with a ranged character and you zoomed out, then you would know what's coming before it got a chance to surprise you. So that's, again, it's the downside of one of the ARPGs that people don't like, being surprised, but it's also one of the strengths of the game, that it keeps the combat interesting and keeps you on your toes. And I to be honest, I've had a look around at all of the other games to see how they do this, and there doesn't seem to be any real fix. In truth, almost every other ARPG has just overcome this obstacle by simply designing the maps around this. And of course, we find ourselves in a game now that looks really beautiful. We've seen from the in-game engine shots that the game looks amazing. Of course, we can't really appreciate that with a top-down view, which kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. But there you go, that's the issue we find ourselves with. However, worth stating though, that not every map is going to be a very large cathedral. There will be more planetary maps, and it's worth pointing out that only one of the 3 current map sets actually has any problems with this. So that's something worth considering as well. As they introduce more maps, it may just be a case of, oh god, I got this mission, it's a bit clumsy with a map, but the others are okay. And Diablo kind of has that as well. It has the odd map that's a little bit awkward. And one final note that I think they could perhaps do a little bit more, outline the enemies. If they're in your character's vision, or if they're firing or doing anything that will give their position away, outline them a little bit clearer to show you where they are, or maybe do something with opacity. I think that's something else to think about. But guys, that's all I really have to say regarding cameras of ARPGs. I know we've waffled on a lot, and I think I've repeated myself quite a lot, but I really wanted to just get these thoughts out into the open. I want your ideas down below as well. Just remember, as always, that my opinion is only my opinion, and I am of course free to be wrong on absolutely anything and everything. So if you've got any ideas of your own, or if you disagree with me, pop that down in the comments below. We'll have a little chat. Let the developers know what you're struggling with in terms of maps and in terms of camera angles. Let us know perhaps if you've played any other games that you feel did it a little bit better. Guys, have a great weekend, and I'll speak to you real soon.